Hey, welcome back to another video in this series. In this video, we're going to talk about another control flow concept called loops. We're talking about what loops are and why we use loops, but let's get to some code here. So all I've done is I've copied our template and I've created video _7. And in the index page, I just switched the H1 tag so you can see this. I'm going to go ahead and let's inspect so we can see our console output. And we have no output right now. In the script tag, I have just added some comments about what we're going to cover. So let's start building this code. First of all, in the last episode, we talked about code blocks. And we're going to use code blocks again here. A for loop uses a for keyword. And the for keyword has 3 sections that you have to fill out. So I'm just going to label these right now AAA. And then these sections are separated by a semicolon. BBB is the second section. And then CCC is the third section. We're going to talk about each of those sections, and I'm going to show you how to create that section and define it in just a moment. Right under the for keyword, we're going to have a code block that's going to get executed over and over. And so what we're going to do is let's go up and create these sections first. AAA, let's just make a note here. AAA, this little part of that section is where we're going to initialize our variables. And that may also entail declaring a variable. So for example, I could say let I equal to 0. I'm declaring the variable I. I'm going to initialize it to 0. I misspelled that. Let me just fix that. I could declare the variable outside the for loop, and I don't need to declare it here. Either way, sometimes I'll have variables that are already declared. I'm just going to use those for the looping variable. Other times I will keep things more concise and just declare it right there inside the for statement itself. So I'm going to do it this way. So that's the first section is I need to initialize the variable. The second section is some kind of truthy expression. This is a Boolean expression. And as long as the expression is true, it's going to keep doing what's inside the code block. Execute if true, essentially. So here, I'm going to say things like I is maybe say it's less than or equal to 5. That's my expression. So I've got my initialization section. I set that variable up. I'm initializing it to 0. And then I have my Boolean expression. While I is less than or equal to 5, I'm going to execute whatever's in this code block. And this last part of the for loop right here, CCC, this is where I'm typically going to update my variable that I initialized. And that's most commonly what you see. And so for example, how am I going to update I? I'm going to say I is plus plus. So I'm going to add 1 to I, or I'm going to say I is plus equal to 2. So I'm going to increment I by 2. All right. Or I could say I is, equal to I times 8. Whatever I'm going to do, I'm going to update the value of I. And so you can imagine now what's going to happen in this loop. The first time the loop happens, I is going to be equal to 0. I'm going to execute this code block. Then it's going to update the value of I. In this case, it's going to say 0 times 8, and I get the value of 0. Then it's going to evaluate the expression. Is I less than or equal to 5? Is 0 less than or equal to 5? In this case, it is. So it's going to do this code block again. And then in this particular example, because I'm always multiplying 0 by 8, I'm going to end up with 0. This is going to be an infinite loop. So in JavaScript, there's nothing really stopping this loop from executing on forever or until all the resources are consumed on your machine. So we want to be careful sometimes of loops, but in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to keep this a simple for loop. And all I'm going to do is you'll see it implemented like this a lot. I++. We're going to increment I by 1. And let's just add some code in here. So console log. This is the for loop, and we're going to show the value of I. So when I run this, let's see what we get over here. You can say for loop, I is 0. That's the first time through. So it gets initialized to 0. We execute the code. Then I increment I by 1. Is I less than or equal to 5? It's 1 right now. And so it is less than or equal to 5. So I'm going to execute the code for loop. And then you can see it prints 1. And then we go to the very top again. I increment I. Now it's 2. 2 less than or equal to 5? Yes, it is. So I'm going to print out for loop, and then I print out the 2. And I keep going until I get to it's 5. I print out the for loop. I go back to the top. I increment it. Now it's 6. Is it less than or equal to 5? No, it's not. At that point, I'm done executing this code block, and I'm going to move on to the rest of the code in my script. So that's a for loop right there. Now, a while loop is a little simpler, has a DDD right there, and it has a code block. And so we already know what our code block is going to look like. But what is our DDD here? Now, for a while loop, DDD is a Boolean expression. So, and again, it's the same thing as a for loop. It will execute that code block if it's true. So as an example, I can say I is less than or equal to 5. Just to keep these clean, I'm going to use a different variable. Let's go with j in terms of this. Now, I don't have j defined here. In this case, I'm going to say let j. I'm going to initialize it outside. I'm going to set it to 0. So see, it's a little different from a for loop. There's no initialization section here inside the while loop. I just have the Boolean expression. I also don't have this incremental or how I'm going to change j. That's not inside here either. So if I were to run this right now, j is equal to 0. Is j less than 5? Yes, it is. And we can might as well print j. If I were to run this, the next time through, it's going to come back to the top. J is still going to be set to 0, and it's going to run this again. And it's going to come back to the top. J is still going to be set to 0. It's going to run this again. One of the differences here is all of these pieces. I had this initialization variable. I had this Boolean expression. Then I had this part where I updated the variable. Those are all pulled out into their own little lines of code here in a while statement. I have to initialize it outside the while. I do have my Boolean expression, but here is where I would want to say j++ or j plus equals 1 or by 2 or whatever we want. So if I were to run this now, let's see what we get. I get the equivalent thing that you saw for the for loop, but now we're using a while loop. Now a do loop is close to a while loop, and it looks like this. Do is the keyword, then we're gonna have the code block, and then down here, we're gonna have the while, and this is the same expression. I'm going to do this code block while whatever this is true. In this case, DDD is exactly the same thing as it was in a while loop. It's a Boolean expression, and execute if true. The difference between do and a while is you can see a while has the opportunity to get out of the loop before it's ever executed. So for example, if I set j is equal to 10 up here, when I hit this while loop, j is less than or equal to 5, that's false. And I'm never going to execute any lines of code here. In a do loop, I don't have that opportunity. As an example, let's go ahead and let's set this back to 0. Let that run there. But I'm going to create another variable up here. Say k is equal to 0. And you can try to create the same loop here. So while k is less than or equal to 5. So this is pretty similar to this one. Let's go ahead and run it and just see if we get the same output. And you can see the do loop has 0 through 5, just like the while loop and just like the for loop. All three of these loops, they output pretty much the same thing, but there's some subtle differences on how they work, right? So the for loop syntactically, I think was a little cleaner. If you already knew a place to initialize it, you have a Boolean expression and you had some update to the variable on every loop. And the while loop, if you need a little more control, you can piece those things apart. And then the same thing with the do loop, but the do loop is always going to get executed at least once. So if I put this as 10 here and 10 here, let's rerun this again. Let's see what I get. You can see that the for loop execute, I didn't change that, but here you can see that the do loop got executed once. Because in the do loop, even though it was 10, it ran the code block, then it evaluated the expression, which turned out to be false, and it didn't go back and do that code block again. But in the while loop, it evaluated the expression, it wasn't less than 10, and it never executed that code block at all. So I'm gonna set these back to 0 just for the purposes of seeing the outputs here. I'm gonna refresh, and I should have all three of those. I want to introduce two new keywords. One is called break and the other is called continue. And to introduce break and continue, I am going to comment out my do loop and I'm going to comment out my while loop. And we're going to go back up to the top and just focus in on our for loop. And just to see what break does, I'm going to introduce it here into our for loop. So the for loop now has a break statement inside of it. If I were to run this again, I don't get any output. And what break does is as soon as you're inside of a loop and you encounter a break statement, the next line of code that's executed is whatever's after the loop. So it just breaks out of the loop. That's why it's called break. We're breaking out of the loop. Now, if I move this to under the console and we run it again, you can see it executed the loop once. I hit this break statement and then I'm outside of the loop. It never executed again, even though my conditional statement up here is still true because I is only equal to 1 in the next loop, but I'm breaking out. So a lot of the times you'll see things like this. Maybe there's a magic number. So if I is equal to 3, then I want to break out. So I have this conditional, right? So if I is equal to 3, we are going to break out of this loop. So let's run this and see what happens then. So you can see for loop 0, 1, 2. So it does do the console log on 3 because it's right here, but now it does this if statement and it runs into the break statement because I equal 3 is true. And then it kicks us out of the for loop. Now this break works inside of whiles and it works inside of the do's exactly the same way. That's why I'm just focusing in on the for loop. I don't want to confuse things, but we could as easily come down here, add the break to a while loop or a do loop, and it operates exactly the same way. So that's the break. Now let's talk about continue. I'm going to switch out my break keyword for a continue keyword right there. And then the only thing I'm going to do to make this clear is I'm going to bump my console statement down below the continue. And so just to be clear, what's going to happen is we're going to initialize I to 0. I'm going to come down through. Is I going to be equal to 3? No, it's not. So I'm going to console log. When I gets updated and it eventually is equal to 3, it's going to execute the continue keyword. Something is going to happen, and we'll visually see that, and then we'll explain what happens. So let's look at that now. I'm going to refresh over here, and let's examine the output. So the output says 0, 1, 2. I don't get a 3, but I get a 4 and a 5. And so that explains what continue means, is when it hit this condition, I equals 3, hit the continue keyword, it doesn't execute any more in this for loop. It doesn't break out of the for loop, so it's not coming down here and executing the next line of code outside the loop. But what it does is it goes immediately from the continue back to the top, and it increments I by 1. So now we're at the 4, and because I equals 3, it's not true anymore. It does print out 4 and 5. So that's what continue does. It allows us to skip the execution of whatever's in this for block under a certain condition. So break breaks us out of there. We don't do any more of the code block at all. Continue allows us to skip the execution of the code block under certain conditions. All right, so that's it for this lesson. So just to recap everything, we started off with a for loop. We talked about the 3 different sections in a for loop. The initialize the variable, the Boolean expression, and then the part where we update the variable. Then we introduced the while loop, and we showed how that kind of split those different sections out. So now there's a part where you can initialize the variable outside the while loop. Inside the while loop, you have your expression, and then you also have to increment the value. Otherwise, you'll end up with an infinite loop. And then same thing with the do loop. And the difference between a while and a do is always executed at least once. Finally, we introduced 2 keywords, break and continue, so that we can use those inside of our loops to control whether I'm going to leave the loop early or if I'm going to conditionally execute the code inside the loop. In the next video, we're going to start talking about functions, how to define them and how to call them. We'll see you next time.